Hello everybody. In the last video we talked about heredity, which is the study of how characters and traits are passed on from generation to generation. And we also talked about the difference between a character and a trait. We talked about the fact that characters are specific features that you're studying, for something like eye color, skin color, hair shape, and things like that. And that the actual specific example of that character, or what you have, you would call it a trait. For example, I have a white or fair skin with a brown hair and brown eye color, and my hair is kind of wavy. And so you have these traits or specific types of a character, like the color pattern of a cat is a character, but the actual color is the trait. Just like a flower color or flower shape are characters. The actual trait will be the flower's color, like pink, like red, like yellow, and so forth. And people were to understand how that worked, and for many years people thought that the way it worked is that a blending happened. So the idea is that basically someone's traits mixed with the traits of someone else when they had babies together. So for example, you see on the left side what a lot of scientists are now considering the face of America. And this was produced at the request of the Time magazine. Also, it was published in the Time. Sorry, it was published in the Time magazine recently. And basically, what they did there is they blended the most common features found in face of American people to create the new face of America, based on what's happening with immigration. That's bringing in new genes, which is causing, and also our predilections are causing a small evolution in the American population that is making it look more like this. I like it. It looks pretty nice. Now, just for fun, I wonder what would happen if you were to mix in Robert Pattinson and Taylor Lautner. So get a little bit of the vampire and a little bit of the hotness of the werewolf, and what do you get? Well, you get something pretty cool and hot, right? No, not really. You can't change a perfect face, so you should just stick with the Taylor Lautner face. But that's what you would see if blending were to take place. And in Photoshop, you can easily do that between two facial features. But if blending happened, it would be like a color change. You know, when you get a blue and yellow and mix them together, you get green. And so you make something new out of the combination of both parents. Now, that does make some sense, and that's why a lot of people thought it was. But let's think about what that would happen if you were to do that. If you get blue and yellow, you make green, right? You see that on the color wheel. If you get blue and red, you make something like purple. If you make yellow and red, you make something like orange. But what happens if you get that orange and you mix with the blue? Well, then you make something that looks like a brown. But what happens if you get the green and you mix with the red? Well, you also make something that looks like brown. Well, what happens if you get something like the purple and mix with your yellow? Well, you also get something like brown. So you see, if we really truly blended our genes together when we have kids, after a few generations, everybody will look how? The same, right? So genetically, let's look at this genetically. The blending theory basically would say, you can see that on the top left here, that two people with different genes will basically donate their genes, and the new look will be a blend of both looks. But that when that blended with somebody else's blend, you essentially get a new blend still. And that's basically the idea of how that would work. Now, in Mendelian genetics, we think of it as differently. We think about the fact that each parent gives particles, which we combine in different ways to create who you are. So it's the idea of particle genetics, or the idea that these particles are separated and never truly mixed together. And it's by the combination of different particles that makes you who you are. But those particles don't necessarily mix. And that means when you get passed on those particles, you may pass one or the other, but not a blend between the two. And so that creates a variability instead of creating the same color. And you see what's happening there with on the top bottom right corner, the difference between them. If you have multiple colors and you blend them, after a few generations, the blend will cause everyone to look the same. But if you have particle genetics, that's never going to happen. The variation is going to be preserved across many generations. And that's what we see in the human race. Clearly, we're not all the same, but we have very lots of differences. And so we learned in the previous chapter that this whole process happens through meiosis. And because of the separation of homologs and crossing over, variation is maintained across generations. And genes stored in the chromosome, which is featured in the middle, are passed on from generation to generation. Now, the people who first studied this didn't know about all this genetic of the chromosome and meiosis and all this stuff. But the first person to actually figure out that things don't blend but are passed through particle genetics was a guy called an Austrian monk named Gregory Mendel. And he did most of his work in where it is now Czech Republic, and you actually see the monastery where he used to live, and the area that used to be his garden. Right here at the corner of the monastery, he used to build a garden. And he studied for many, many years several experiments, and this is an actual picture of the experiment that he created and put in his book, and so, on his notes, sorry. And so, it's funny because he died kind of in obscurity. Nobody really knew about him. And it was much later, many years later, actually, 40 years later or so, that his work was rediscovered. And he actually sent his work to Darwin. And most people think that Darwin never even opened his work. And that's a shame, because Darwin could really have benefited a lot from his work. Darwin didn't really understand how evolution happened and what actually caused the variation that was necessary to drive his evolution machine that he called natural selection. But between Darwin and Mendel, these are perhaps the most famous biologists of all time. And both of them are research-based biologists which changed the history of biology forever. And so, definitely a very important scientist. And what did he do? What did Mendel do? So let's talk about that. He studied heredity. He basically worked with pea plants, and pea plants look like what you see here in the screen, and you see the actual shoot of the pea plant and the roots of the pea plant, and you see that they have these pods where the peas will actually grow, and they have these leaves which can be broad leaves usually, and they have flowers also, like nice purple flowers. And so that's a pea plant. And that's what he used to study. That's what he grew in that garden that I showed you in the previous video. Now, he spent 7 years studying the features of that pea plant. And he studied several different characters which had different traits. But the cool thing about pea plants is that they have very discrete characters. Unlike humans, which have characters like eye color, skin color, hair color, which are made of multiple thousands of different things, the characters of pea plants are very simple. Either you have a spherical shape or a wrinkled shaped pea. Either you have a yellow pea or you have a green pea. Either the flower is purple or the flower is white. Either the pod looks inflated or it looks constricted. It's either green or yellow. The flower is either on top or on the sides. The stem is either high or short. And so these distinctive 7 traits is what he studied. And it took him 7 years to study all those traits and make sense out of how they worked. And basically, he had to go through thousands of plants and thousands of regenerations of plants until he actually figured out patterns of inheritance. And he noticed that there was something going on here that was determining the way the flowers look. He was understanding that when you mix certain flowers, you always get certain ratios. For example, every time you get a purple versus a white flower, you get a 3-to-1 ratio of purple to white. Every time you get an axial versus terminal flower, you get a 3-to-1 ratio of axial. Every time you mix a yellow with a green, you get a 3-to-1 ratio of yellow. So he noticed that one of the traits seemed to dominate over the other and get a 3-to-1 ratio after 2 generations. What's is interesting about this? After 2 generations, all these traits, look at them. All these traits pretty much showed a 3-to-1 ratio. But look at how many plants did he have to grow to actually analyze each trait when he did each trait separately. And that's why it took him so many years to do it. To actually get these ratios. If you only do it a few times, you miss the pattern. So he had to do this many, many times, and it was a lot of research that it took him to do it until he finally saw the pattern. But I mean, after he put his data together and he saw this, he saw there was a pattern here. That after 2 generations, one of the traits was 3 times more common than the other on average. And you see that on average this is actually true. And so this is actually what opened his eyes to realize that there's actually a pattern of inheritance that no one realized before. And it wasn't blending that was happening, it was something else, because after 2 generations, people don't look, all the peas didn't look the same. Instead, they looked different. So he realized that it couldn't be blending. They had to be doing something else. And he was the father of particle genetics, and he pretty much got it right. Everything I'm teaching you in this lecture series is Mendel's idea. Nothing new that I'm going to has come out about that. So Mendel has figured all of this out. So it's pretty amazing that he actually came up with all of this basically by researching peas. And you can actually do this today. We have something called Wisconsin fast plants, and if you want to do level 5 on that, we can go outside, we can plant a garden, and they will grow very, very fast. And so you can actually test in 2 generations of pea plants what Mendel said and see if you get a 3-to-1 ratio. It's pretty amazing. Now, why did he use pea plants? You know, why did he use these pea plants? Why did he choose something else to study? Well, there's 2 reasons. First of all, the pea plants can reproduce very fast because they make a lot of seeds, a lot of pods. They also grow very fast. So that means that you don't have to wait many years between generations. If you were doing this with humans, each generation of human is minimal, usually about 13 years, because you have to hit puberty before you can have a child. So the minimal will be 13 years. But on average, a human generation is 25 years. Can you imagine tracking many generations of this? And you would have to do this with thousands of people. And since most people only have 1 kid at a time, instead of a peas have multiple kids at a time, it would take thousands of years to study the same thing that he studied using peas. And that's why he used peas. He also, unlike humans, where the characters are determined with traits which are polymorphic or have multiple features, in the peas, it's either one way or the other. So you have these 7 very discrete, very clear traits, which is it's like heads or tails. And which means it's much easier to understand what's happening there than what it is in humans. Also, something crucial for pea plants, and we'll talk about why this is important later in the lecture, but pea plants actually have the ability of crossing with themselves. Their flowers have both the male and the female parts inside the flower, which allows you to actually do something that's called self-pollination, or having the plant have sex with itself. And by doing that, Mendel could control the actual sexual reproduction of the plant and make sure that he knew what was happening there. He can control, remember, you want a control experiment, and we're going to talk about how he did that in the next video. And so, after many years of studying this, he actually found his solution. He figured out that there was not blending, that instead, some magic particle was being carried from generation to generation. Something was happening and we're going to talk about how he figured this out in the other video, but he figured out that a particle carried by mom, carried by dad, and given to you was causing you to be who you are. And that was by the combination of particles between your mom and your dad that created who you are. Mendel called this factor. And later on, when we discovered the DNA molecule, we call those genes. And then we named the field genetics, which is the study of genes. So Mendel is called the father of modern genetics, or particle genetics, because he figured out that instead of blending, you passed on genes by giving a small particle which combines with a particle of the other parent, and the combination, which is different from blending. It's not like you get sugar and salt and make you make a new flavor, but you still have the sugar and the salt separate from each other. You didn't make a new spice. You understand what I'm saying? So that is how it works, and that is what Mendel figured out. Now, what he actually figured out was trying to understand. The problem that he had when he first looked at the flowers was this. Sometimes he would get a purple flower and a white flower, and he would get purple flowers. Sometimes he would get a purple flower and a white flower, and he would get both purple and white flowers in the children. Sometimes he got flowers that were purple and mixed them with themselves, and they made all kinds of flowers, purple and white. Sometimes he got purple flowers, mixed them with themselves, and he got purple flowers. So he was like, what's happening here? I mix the same flower with itself, and it makes different things. But other times, it makes the same thing. And so he saw that it didn't make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. How can I get different results different times? What is happening here? Well, the answer was that he discovered that there was two ways of being red, for example. Why is it that one time you put red versus red and you get all the colors, red and white, but sometimes you get red versus red and you get red? That's because there's two different ways of being red. He discovered what he would call the heterozygous genotype. And we'll talk about what that is in the next video. But by discovering that there was two different ways of being read, it opened his mind to understanding this whole process of particle genetics. Now, he didn't know about the actual chromosomes and that genes were stored in DNA. That came much later. But he already discovered, opened the door for the discovery of this gene, because people started to search for this mystical particle that he discovered and talked about later. And so that is Mendel genetics. And in the next video, we're actually going to talk about how it works.